bringing your film to this part of the country. I think it makes us conscious of a lot of things that we probably wouldn't be aware of otherwise. For example, after watching the film, I realized a lot of times the first thing that comes up in conversation when you meet somebody new is, where are you from? I mean, after they ask you your name, the next question is, where are you from? And so then we have to go back and think about how we want to define ourselves. And for the Khasis, I understand it's partly linguistic, it's partly cultural, it's partly religious, it's partly the relationship with the land and where you come from. So what has it been like for you growing up there in the 80s and 90s and seeing what you saw at that age, and how has that shaped how you define yourself?
Thank you for bringing the film to the festival as well. To go back to your first statement about where you're coming from, I think that question in itself has so many different meanings in different parts of the country. Say in Delhi, for example, it's a huge economic marker. So where you stay also determines the kind of financial background that you also come from. But say perhaps in a tribal society, it's more of a geographic marker. Spaces are not aligned according to economic preferences, I would say. So you might have a neighbor who's a chief minister, and at the same time, your next door neighbor is also someone else from a not so privileged background. But as far as moving away from that kind of space and having been outside since the age of 15, and also constantly trying to figure out what eventually is what this idea of home is supposed to be. I think it's something that I still constantly try to battle. Like I live between Delhi and Shillong right now, and I live in a flat in Delhi as opposed to a home in Shillong, which is normal for everybody in the sense that a house in Shillong, which actually means that the floor above you is also yours, or the space in front of you is also yours, as opposed to someone staying upstairs and downstairs, and the only thing that belongs to you are the four walls around you. So yeah, it's a very difficult concept to come to terms with, because spaces are also changing based on commercial lines. So there's a part of the film where I address that, and finally to your last point about growing up in town during the 80s and 90s, it was very confusing because you couldn't quite make out what was going on. It's not, I wouldn't say it was as violent as the other spaces in that part of the country. But yeah, it does shape a lot into how you make sense of people around you. It does shape a lot of the work that you do eventually. And I've witnessed firsthand a lot of events that have happened back home, and of course, they didn't make sense at that point of time. But now, as you start, working on things, and as you reflect on your childhood and your previous memories, then they somehow manifest itself into some kind of meaning. So this was a direct reaction to my first fiction film, 1987, which was more or less about the riots as well, and it was historical fiction and taking into account several historical events and creating a narrative fiction. And people would come and say, "You're too young to understand this," So I guess this stemmed from a slightly more angered position about this is what I have to say as well. So therefore, the film.
And in some ways, has the journey of making the film been a process where you're figuring out these answers for yourself? And is that still a process that is going on? Or what is that like? And also your experience of moving to Delhi and being an outsider in Delhi? Did you feel like an outsider in Delhi, or what was that like?
Yes, absolutely. I don't, look at this. This is particularly subscribed to whatever conventional standards, but I think it's very interesting because I stayed in an Afghan neighborhood in Delhi, so I'm a minority within a minority, and it's a constant living experiment, you could say. But as far as finding space, that's a very, very political question which will go on, address the secessionist histories and Um, but yeah, being in Delhi and being away from home also removes you from that space, you know. So you have time to actually think about, like for example, like, you know, I'd shoot the film. I was shooting the film for a period of 2 years, and it was very, very difficult for you to make sense. And as I forget the filmmaker yesterday said something very poignant. Anirban, yeah, he said something about when you shoot, you're really thinking. You know, it's only when you sit on the edit table, even at the edit table, you're still constantly figuring out, like, you know, where to put what. And for non-fiction, you know, that's when the script is actually being made. So I would go home and shoot for, at a stretch, 10 days, you know, just completely immerse myself and shoot, and then sit back in Delhi and, you know, look at all this footage and try to make some meaning out of it, you know, try to script the film that way. So yeah, I think it's very important that you also remove yourself from your subjects when you're removing, so that, you know, you don't get too emotionally attached, and you somehow remove yourself from taking this slightly biased position. So I think it was very important for me to also be part of the space that I come from, but also to be an observer and address what was going on.
My last question, if I open it out to the audience. I was wondering if you could describe for us the continuum that exists in the aspirations that young people and old people among Khasis. Are there people who want to move on with times, and, you know, for whom this isn't as much of a conflict as it is for others? And at the other extreme, there are people who are doing whatever they can to preserve what they can before, for example, they go down the either Sikkim or Tripura way.
I think it's a dilemma that's being faced by a lot of young people in the country. You know, I don't think it's restricted to say young people from where I come from. The whole idea of culture, the whole idea of you know, what things are supposed to be, the whole imagination that these things are set in stone. You know, we do not want to accept the fact that culture is always changing over a period of time. So I know of people who live in Delhi from very, very privileged economic backgrounds, from very privileged cultural backgrounds, and, you know, well educated, who still adhere to these most archaic and most primitive ideas of existence. You know, and it's very difficult for you to say that this is right or this is wrong. But I think that you know, and this is a personal opinion. I think that perhaps subscribing to a lot of Sartrean ideologies, or but I think that it's very important to doubt everything, to question everything, and to not just take things because, you know, your previous generation has told you it might have worked well at that point of time. It might still work now, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, it works perfect. You know, so I always tell this to younger people that you know, just because your parents have said whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow it. And yeah.
Any questions?
Do you notice your kind of cultural sensitivity among people in your age group in Delhi who are not necessarily Khasis?
See, the only reason why I'm so attached to all of this is because I was very much part of it, in the sense that, you know, I took part in a lot of cultural activities that, you know, were synchronous with what Khasis did. I think when you move to urban spaces, the idea of culture is very different. You know, there is this huge idea of this huge concept of a consumerist culture. You know, so which is a culture in itself. You know, let's not deny that. So you know, in conventional standards, as to do they know their so-called traditional culture? No, but they do take part in a different kind of culture. So, for example, like I'll give you this very interesting idea of how the mods in the UK came about, and how the punks in the UK came about, and how other countercultural organizations in different parts of the world came about. You know, they were always centered around economic spaces. So working class neighborhoods gave birth to an entire generation of you know, punk music, which slowly became part of the whole industry, which now nurtures that kind of music and has commercialized it. Similarly with the mods, they had to look smart and dress smart because they were hanging around shopping spaces and malls, and they couldn't afford to look like ragamuffins. So yeah, but so this question of culture is what is this culture? We tend to assume
culture, I'm defining it in the Oxford English Dictionary sense. Integrity of thought, for which you need a certain continuity, which you seem to have here. I'm thinking of non-Khasis. I have one particular Khasi from my generation, probably quite a big light in Delhi now. Was a good friend and very close. I didn't notice anything particularly non-Khasi in his outlook. This is 40 years ago. But you, 40 years later, you seem to have a huge cultural perspective, That's why I asked you this question also, because I think you answered it. I'm not very familiar with people 40 years younger than me, or 20 or 30 years ago. But I wonder whether they have that integrity of thought when you talk about culture. It does not necessarily mean steeped in history and all. I think I got the.
There is.
I don't want to make it too complicated.
No, you're right. On the other hand, like a lot of young people are part of this entire, Khasi Hills National Awakening movement, and they say things like, we need to, maintain a culture, we need to maintain our identity, and I think that that's a lot of what other people would say as well, as far as right-wing ideological movements are concerned in the rest of the country.
Your Mekong Delta past?
We are Mon Khmer in anthropologically speaking, so.
Oh, really?
Hi, my question is about regarding the role of the government. Since as a child, I was always amused at protests from various sections in the country. I read about the protests. So, from your perspective, what do you think where does the government stand as far as your issue is concerned against the infiltrators?
Fear needs a face. Fear needs a face. So it's always easy to appropriate any kind of responsibility to a particular ethnic group. It's not something that is only taking place in the country, it takes place everywhere in the world. So when there's a national crisis, it's always easy to blame it on someone and blame someone else for it. Yeah.
What I meant was that mostly people consider government as an opposite identity, like government versus people. They make it government versus people when protests happen. So regarding to that, what do you think? Do you think government is against the people over there?
Do I think the government is against people? Wow, that's an entire thesis there. I can't answer this question right now. We can talk about it, but okay. I don't think I can summarize that in a 15-minute discussion.
Very good film. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a few questions. First is a lot of recent historical research is showing that identities in pre-colonial India were more fluid, and with the coming of colonial rule and their techniques of enumeration, it got more fixed. Like for example, the Naga identity. There were a lot of Naga tribes, and a lot of researchers say that the emergence of the Naga identity and Naga nationalism comes with the hardening of identity under the British rule. So what was the Khasi identity pre-colonial rule? Was it also quite fluid, and do you think the colonial rule hardened it? Secondly, one of the things which I didn't get from the film is the divisions within the Khasi movement, like in terms of class or rural-urban. Is there only one movement? Are there other Khasi organizations who are opposed to the one which is shown in the movie? So this one. And third, what are the safeguards one can design to I mean, what are the safeguards one can have for a local community which is not discriminatory to the other communities? I mean, what are the like property safeguards? I mean, what are the things which, I mean, this is just a general question I'm thinking.
As far as your first question of cultures being fluid, yes, I agree in the sense that if you look at, say, certain rituals like the whole Tangjat where you marry an outsider and you have a certain kind of I call it facilitation process. I'm not particularly religious, but to say that this person is now a part of us and therefore we have to bring about a new clan altogether. So that way, being fluid in that sense, you're right. But I think that to answer your question is how much of these traditional laws find space in the laws of the country, So there are certain traditional laws which say that like the land which the new Shillong township people are that they're planning to build those township spaces is a traditional land called Dirai, which the concept is almost like primitive socialism, neither alienable, neither can you sell it, neither can it just be, left barren. And if you have to look at tribal identities, it's always synchronous to their relationship with the land, So now there have been proposals to take away these lands from them because they're not, papers. When the written script only came to us when the Welsh missionary Thomas Jones, came about. So this is a clash between the traditional laws and the modern laws, and I think that is what creates a lot of problems as well. Your second point, which is about, can you please tell me what?
Yeah, like the divisions within the Khasi
divisions,
movement. Yeah.
So the demand for the inner line permit was something that was being executed, which was demanded by, I think, 13 and then it became 12. So 10 to 12 pressure groups were demanding for the inner line permit. On one hand, you can see that, it's a very racist, let's be straightforward about it. It's quite, because you're saying that, this person can't move from one space to the other. But then on the other hand, there's the dilemma of having, say, a multinational company just coming there and taking away the space that belongs to you, in this ban of development. That's another argument altogether, like what is development, what is not. So to a certain degree, you can understand where this kind of paranoia comes from. You can understand where this kind of insecurity comes from. But then sometimes, it manifests itself into, a very, very anti-people or anti-particular race kind of a movement, And it's not something new either. Like when Foucault has written a lot about this, when the Iran Revolution happened, it transformed itself into a completely Islamic state, But the interesting thing is what a lot of these people who demand for this kind of a right-wing ideology that people from any part of the world ask for is to change the present situation, so that fundamentally you go back to what it actually was. And when you say that you want to go back to what it actually was, you're assuming that your past was this perfect repository, which is quite untrue. No? And in the case for say like for a community like the Khasis who say, we should go back to what it was when we had rights and this and that. But then if you go back to what it was, it also means that you're also much more accommodating community as far as interpersonal relationships are concerned. And then it also manifests itself into I think it's only probably because we're a matrilineal setup that it manifests itself into a kind of a hostage situation of your reproductive rights, So like this journalist here goes to Delhi and says that a Khasi language is not an endangered language, and then goes back home and says we're a small community and then we should not allow non-tribal men to marry. So that and as far as your point about history is concerned, the writing of history is always a political act. There's some Morris Suzuki writes a lot about this. How about there are as many histories as there are as many communities or as many countries, and also like how history is always this this beacon for regionalism, this beacon for communalism, just as much as opium is this blinding. I mean, opium is to heroin. There's this very interesting analysis of what religion also does to what Marx says. Opium is the but yeah, so so this idea of history itself is whose history are we reading? And it's you've got like revisionist historians in the country as well who say that So so this was my interpretation of this as well. You could say that this was also like some kind of historical narration of how I perceive cultural events in that sense.
Maybe I'm loud enough. I guess in the process of making a documentary, just wanted to, your thoughts on how you think about words and images. So how do you figure out what you want to accomplish with the voiceover and what you want to accomplish with visuals? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out because I started my foray into the arts through music. I was a musician first and then got into filmmaking. To answer your question, I think it was always about, I knew exactly that, what I wanted to do with the visual and what I wanted to do with the voice. So every time that you have a voiceover, it's always me confessing something, or it's always me perhaps trying to make sense of certain events. And also in that sense a little, and also in that sense a little old-fashioned because tribal species are so connected to each other. So you're also looking at film in itself as what is the purpose of making a film, and maybe I'm being a little old-fashioned about this because I'm assuming that people watch this film back home and actually like rethink about what they think of what is going on. So in that sense, that perhaps this film will somehow shape people's idea of how society is. We're now screening in a very different kind of a space, but when you go back home, it's the fine lines of glass are also blurred. It is not as rigid as you would see in other spaces. But the visuals, yeah, like I said, I shot for 2 years and I had a lot of footage at my disposal. So it was also about where do I just let the visuals do the talking. So for example, there's a little sequence there immediately after the journalist says that so and so dresses up like so and so and speaks. The language is very important and dress is very important. And then there's a tourist spot in Shillong where people get their photographs taken and they put on the traditional. So I didn't want to explain that. It's a beautiful analogy, and at the end, like this man doing the tailoring, and so it speaks a lot about the whole idea of dress and fashion as well. And also music as well. Like I didn't want to have any recognizable sounds because recognizable sounds become music. I didn't want to put any minor chords because you're also adding more to the catharsis and the sadness of the film, or you're adding some kind of a element to that. So it was like unrecognizable sounds, just a bass guitar being driven in the background, but soundscapes, unrecognizable sounds. So I didn't want the audience to be so to say seduced by the sound as much as the visuals or the voice that way.
If I could just also ask you, you narrate some stories to us about, I think these are stories, you said your grandmother or grandfather told you a story about the beast that would eat only Khasis, and there must be a lot of other stories like that. So could you tell us about...
So I grew up in my grandmother's house, and I was just mentioning this to someone the other day, and it's a joint family, so I think there are roughly about 30 people in that one household. And when we were kids, we used to sit around the hearth, and grandmother would tell us all these stories. And now I go back, and there's a flat screen TV, and there's a lot of Bollywood serials going on there. So yeah, and we would listen to these stories about a lot of different things, a lot of these folk tales, and so I don't want to romanticize the past, but it shaped a lot of how I understood the world around me as well when I was a child. So and the more you reflect on these folk tales as you age, the more meaning it has. So back then it was just this serpent who would eat people, but now like when I look at it, it manifests itself into this idea of development, or this idea of nation building, or this idea of corruption, of how things that are supposed to be a utilitarian kind of an idea of a greatest good for all comes at the cost of certain people. So yeah, but now like the interesting thing is how these spaces also have changed. So from this hearth, you've got a flat screen TV, and someone else is doing the role of telling you stories. So yeah.
Does that bother you, or is this something that was inevitable?
No, it doesn't bother
So then
me.
is there
My grandmother's quite happy about it, so I can't decide on her behalf, you know what I mean?
And have you ever felt the need to sort of do something to preserve these stories and to preserve these spaces?
Preserve or conserve? Anyways, but yeah, I think it's important to know. I think it's always nicer to know more and more things. But I don't think that you're from so and so, so therefore you have to eat dosa, or that kind of, because that's a lot of thought, that similar kind of thought that takes place as well. That you are Khasi, therefore you have to speak this language, or you have to dress this way. Whether it disturbs me that TV has taken over a lot of our private spaces, yeah, it does at a personal level. Only because of what it shows. But then, you can't, there's no way that you can stop this from happening.
Your grandmother also watches all these Bollywood serials?
Yes, she does. And the best part is that she can't even speak Hindi, so or understand Hindi, so yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. We have one more film on memory and nostalgia later this afternoon, Sandhya's film. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. So we take a lunch break now, and we come back for the next screening at 2 o'clock. One small request, all of us wash our own cups. So once you've had tea and coffee, if you could please also just wash it and keep it on the side, that would be great. And if you need anything else, just get in touch with one of us.